Everyone, I'm really excited today to be presenting a regeneration monitoring protocol for the restoration of coniferous plantations back to hardwood forests in Southern Ontario. The idea for the project was thought of by Aaron Day at Credit Valley Conservation, and I was also supervised by Professor Ben Kuttner here at the University of Toronto. I'll start with a quick introduction to the topic of coniferous plantation restoration. As many of you are probably aware, there are lots of pine, but also some spruce plantations that were established several decades ago on old agricultural fields in Southern Ontario. And what's happening now is these plantations are being thinned every 10 to 15 years or so in some places to encourage regeneration of local hardwood tree species. And the idea is that these sites will one day return back to hardwood forests. And the success of natural hardwood regeneration in these sites is dependent on a lot of factors, including light availability and availability of local seed sources. So it's important to monitor the success of the regeneration to ensure that there is indeed enough of it to one day form a canopy once all those coniferous trees are no longer there. So in Ontario, tree regeneration is usually measured as a part of silvicultural effectiveness monitoring, which is really just a way to test that the management actions that we implement are actually having the results that we want them to. But this type of monitoring is usually applied to industrial forestry, which takes place on landscapes covered in natural forests and includes typical harvesting systems like shelter woods. And this is pretty different than what we see in Southern Ontario. In the coniferous plantations in Southern Ontario, the thinning process takes many decades, and remember that these forests were established on old agricultural fields, so the soil conditions and understory conditions are quite challenging for forest development. And with all this in mind, I've put together a regeneration monitoring protocol for this context. So the objectives of my presentation today are to describe the new monitoring protocol, to discuss some results of testing it, and also to discuss the suitability of the standards and methodologies that I selected. I developed the methods for the monitoring protocol during my time as an intern this summer with Credit Valley Conservation, and it was a process of literature review with some site visits. So the Venn diagram there, that shows the three overlapping regeneration standards that I ultimately identified. So there's three different levels. The smallest would be the small region standard, which is applicable to everything 30 centimeters and taller. The intermediate standard is the FTG height standard, or free to grow height standard, which applies to everything 2 meters and taller. And the highest standard would be the basal area standard. So that applies when those hardwood trees have reached a DBH of 10 centimeters. The blue squares indicate the sources that informed all of these standards. As you can see, the free to grow and basal area standard are informed by Ontario Forest Management Plans, and I've specifically referred to the Ottawa Valley FMP. However, in a lot of places in Ontario, the minimum free to grow height for hardwood trees is 2 meters, and that's pretty tall. So I needed to look to some United States guides for northern hardwood management to find some standards that applied to smaller regeneration for hardwoods. This is a detailed breakdown of that those three overlapping standards that I showed in the previous slide. As you can see, for 100% stocking, I've identified the density in stems per hectare for each of those height classes. And I've also identified the density in stems per hectare by height class for the minimum 40% standard. As well, I've circled the percent stocking that each tree in a plot equals. And what you want to notice there is that larger trees count for more stocking, and these percent stocking values are specific to the plot size that I've selected. The plot size and layout is really important to the survey methodology, but before I describe that, I've said the word density and stocking a couple of times now. They are related. So density is simply the abundance of trees per unit area. Stocking is similar, but there's spacing and distribution requirements. We want to know, are the trees actually fully occupying the site? So with that said, the diagram on the left shows how regeneration stocking of multiple height classes is usually assessed in Ontario. These are called STARS plots. However, in order to use this method, I would have had to create two new plot sizes to account for the small regeneration standard that I created. And so instead of using that, I decided to use the one plot size, and I found a way to combine all these multiple density standards in the field using this one plot size. Just note that in the Ontario method, percent stocking is the percent of plots occupied, with a plot being fully occupied with one tree. But in this method, we're telling multiple trees per plot, and percent stocking is a way to combine these density standards. So there's some differences there. This is a very brief overview of the survey methodology. The simplest is probably assessing the basal area standard. So stalking for trees by basal area is assessed on yield tables. So the surveyor would simply do a basal area sweep for hardwood trees only, not the conifer overstory, get a height estimate and apply yield tables later. What's interesting is how the free to grow and small regen standards are assessed in that fixed area plot. So the surveyor would start with the free to grow standard and start tallying the tallest trees first. And the surveyor stops tallying trees when they've reached 100% stalking in the plot, if that plot can reach 100% stalking. And these are the tables that a surveyor could use to know when they've reached that 100% level. I also put together an Excel-based data analysis workbook that automatically tells you if the compartment you surveyed has met any standard. In this example here, the middle standard has some cells highlighted in green, and that's telling us that for this example, it was the free to grow standard that was met. I also want to point out that I built in a tool to adjust species acceptability. It's not that any tree species is actually unacceptable. It's just that as a forest manager, when you're looking at your tree regeneration, and you know that some of those tree species are going to be affected by invasive pests and pathogens, you might want to consider a scenario where that regeneration doesn't survive or make it to the canopy. And so you can change species acceptability and see how it affects your stalking. And so I tested the new protocol at Robert Baker Forest in the Credit Valley watershed. It's a pretty neat forest. It's got several coniferous compartments, but also some hardwood compartments mixed in, which are great seed sources. It's been thinned a few times, but the last time that it was thinned was in the 1990s. And I assessed all the standards in this site, even though it was clear to me that only the smallest two were applicable. As for results, this is a visualization of what those different stalking levels look like for the free to grow standard. On the left, that is barely any stalking. All you can see is the coniferous overstory. And if you look closely, there's a tiny bit of hardwood regeneration in the corner. On the right, in contrast, that is 100% free to grow stalking of hardwood species. There's so much hardwood regen, you can barely see the coniferous overstory. So we know that once the coniferous overstory is thinned out, that compartment or that plot will be doing extremely well. And in the middle, that's 32% stalking, and that's quite close to that 40% minimum that we identified as the minimum standard. This is an overview of the results by compartment, and I just wanted to point out that the most applicable standard for Robert Baker Forest for the hardwood regeneration is the free to grow standard, with the main height class being over 6 meters. That makes sense given that this regeneration would have been released back in the 90s, so it's had several years to grow to that height. And the main species were sugar maple, black cherry, and white ash. So this is a more detailed summary table of some of the quantitative outputs from the data analysis workbook that I put together. Using compartment 4 as an example, we can see that it has 75% free to grow stalking. But if you consider that the white ash might not survive and make it due to emerald ash borer, the stalking drops to 56%. And if you wanted to compare it to small regeneration stalking, that's circled in green there, you can see that the small regeneration stalking is less. So we know that it's the free to grow standard that's applicable here. We're just a bit uncertain about species acceptability. And so I wanted to go over some management implications. That's the whole point of these regen surveys. We want to know, what does this mean? What should we do? And so again, using compartment 4, we can ask, has the regeneration standard been met? The answer is yes. But when we ask, has the standard been met without unacceptable species? The answer is no. So in that scenario, we might want to consider planting, but we could also just continue to monitor it to make sure that what's there does survive. The results are pretty close for this compartment. As well, the management decisions that we make following a survey are also dependent on the past management that has been implemented. If you look at compartments 3 and 5, they failed the standard, but they've only been thinned once. Whereas the compartments that did meet the standard have been thinned 3 times. The problem is that the number of thinnings is really closely correlated to heavy spruce in the overstory. So just to make sure that it is treatment driving this difference, we did a quick statistical analysis and ANOVA. And so we have the free to grow stalking on the y-axis, and the classes for treatment are first thinning or third thinning. And the classes for spruce presence are some spruce, no spruce, or lots of spruce. As you can see, compartments that have lots of spruce and were only thinned once have low stalking. And then stands that were thinned 3 times and have only some spruce or little spruce have a lot of stalking, but there's basically no difference in spruce between the stands that have some spruce and no spruce. And so you can see that the p-value is insignificant for spruce. We know that it's the treatment that's driving this difference in stalking. So with that in mind, the forest manager can make some decisions based on past treatment. So for compartments 3 and 5, we can say, has the standard been met? The answer is no, but this stand or these compartments have only been thinned once. And so my recommendation would be to do another thinning and reassess the regeneration after that. Give the compartment a second chance. And with those results, there are just a couple points I wanted to highlight for discussion. First of all, I think one of the big results of the testing the protocol is that 40% minimum is extremely useful. That 40% minimum standard successfully differentiated between stands that were thinned 3 times and stands that were only thinned once. And this pass-fail threshold is super useful for decision-making. And as we saw in a couple of compartments, some stands that were thinned 3 times were pretty close to that minimum. So it looks like that is the correct standard. And even though the small regeneration standard wasn't as applicable in this forest, in this table with the arrows, I just want to highlight there's this inverse relationship between free to grow stalking and small regen stalking. We see this pattern also reported in the Canadian literature on hardwood regeneration, where if there's more taller regeneration, then the smaller regeneration is reduced. And so that means that it was meaningful to have these 2 different standards within this fixed area plot because it's telling us about 2 different stages of forest development. And lastly, I just wanted to place the new survey protocol in the general context of silvicultural survey methodology. In the matrix on the left, I just wanted to point out that I would say this new protocol is a multi-height class well-spaced density protocol. Again, we're calling that well-spaced density is one way of measuring stalking, with the alternative being the stocked quadrant method or those stars plots used in Ontario. And also, I just wanted to know if the sort of features of my protocol make sense. And so I looked to a recent study by Bilodeau-Gauthier 2020, and they looked at Canadian silvicultural survey methods and some from the US. And they wanted to reach some conclusions about which methods are best for predicting future regeneration composition. And ultimately, their conclusions or recommendations are based on density, stalking, and stalking of the tallest trees in the plot. And I've combined all of these features into my survey protocol. So I think that the new protocol takes a really balanced approach. However, there are some gaps in my current case study. As you saw, the most applicable regeneration standard was the free to grow standard. So I would love to survey more coniferous plantations that have only been thinned once or have been thinned for many decades, and maybe the regeneration there is in the basal area standard. That being said, the protocol is ready to be implemented in the Credit Valley watershed and elsewhere. And so I'd love to do some more surveys. Thank you so much for listening. I would especially like to thank my supervisors, CDC staff that I worked with, and I wanted to also thank those that helped me with my fieldwork, specifically Madison Postma, Zoe Bedford, and Ben as well. And if you have any questions or want to ask me about my protocol, I put my U of T email here. Thanks so much for listening.